Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum. On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, our old pal Bart Torvik is back. We are going to take a look ahead at the Wisconsin Badgers for this season. Bart, obviously a Wisconsin Badgers fan. And by the way, if you don't know Bart, BartTorvik.com, one of the go-to college basketball analytics sites. I'm sure you've heard of Ken Palm. If you haven't heard of Bart's site, you definitely need to go there, definitely need to use it as another tool, another source for just analyzing college basketball, analyzing the efficiency rankings. His preseason rankings are already out. You can see them. As we allude to, you're not going to be very happy with where Indiana is, but Bart adds some important context with that as far as that goes. But we talk about Wisconsin, what to expect from them coming up this season. Bart, a very informed and loyal Wisconsin fan, but does provide good objective analysis. And then we talk about the Big Ten as a whole, and then go into some talk about college basketball analytics, his thoughts on the net, and more. Always a very engaging and insightful conversation with Bart. So that is this week on Podcast on the Brink. Before we get to that, a quick word from this week's sponsor, SeatGeek. Do you ever feel like ticketing websites make getting to the event difficult on purpose? It's like they're so big that they can get away with not caring about the customer experience. So what if their site's annoying and doesn't have the events you want? Hello, status quo. The real question is, how easy could it be if those ticketing sites actually cared? So why is SeatGeek better than the rest? Well, a quick look at the App Store shows over 50,000 five-star reviews. How's that for customer satisfaction? And they have all those reviews because they provide a better process. SeatGeek pulls together millions of tickets from all over the web. They rate each deal on a scale of 1 to 10, and they display them on an interactive seat map. Basically, SeatGeek breaks down the details. Green dots mean good deals, red dots are overpriced, so that you can find out that information in an instant just looking there at the site. And every purchase is fully guaranteed, so you can shop for tickets with confidence. I have the SeatGeek app on my phone. I use it. It's by far the fastest and easiest way to buy tickets. When my wife and I are looking for concert tickets or baseball tickets, stuff to do in the basketball offseason, SeatGeek is the place that we go to find tickets. And they will even give you $10 off your first SeatGeek purchase. All you need to do is use our promo code. Download the SeatGeek app today. Use the promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, for $10 off your first purchase. That's promo code BRINK for $10 off your first purchase. All right, and now here's our conversation with Bart Torvik. Bart, always great to have you on the show. Welcome back.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So every offseason, we kind of go through the Big Ten, look at each team. And so we're going to kind of use this, kind of double up. We're going to use this as our Wisconsin preview because, as a lot of people know, you are a fan of the Badgers and a very knowledgeable observer of the Badgers. And then we'll also talk about your ranking system and kind of where it has teams in the Big Ten, and specifically where it has some Indiana, or where it has Indiana, which I'm sure you've gotten a few unpleasant tweets about from Indiana fans this offseason. So we'll get to that. But let's start with the Badgers. And this is obviously going to be the first time in 2 decades that Wisconsin enters a season without Ethan Happ on the roster. So it's going to look a lot different. Just generally speaking, what are you expecting from Wisconsin in the first year post Ethan Happ?
Well, I guess my personal expectations are more on the optimistic side, as you might guess. I think my projections have them ranked around 25th. And that would be my hope, that they're that kind of borderline top 25 team. But there's obviously a lot of question marks with Ethan Happ gone, and he was one of the more pivotal players for any team, really ever, at least on offense, and also a very good defensive player. So there's a lot of question marks. And I guess the way I think about it is, if this were 6 or 7 years ago, and we had the same situation, people would be like, this is kind of a classic Bo Ryan will, surprise us as he always does. And people would be slotting the Badgers in around 25th. But obviously Bo Ryan's not there anymore. And it's fair to dock them for that. And because Greg Gard has been a little up and down. And certainly we don't know whether he's got that kind of keep the train moving sort of results that Bo Ryan used to get. So, like a lot of teams, as I'm sure we'll talk about, there's you can make a case either way. And the good case is that they're bringing back a lot of shooters, a lot of guys who, are still pretty young and should improve. A lot of juniors, their junior class is pretty strong. And so that's and they've got Nate Reuvers, who's, one of the better recruits they've had in a while, who you might expect to jump into that kind of Jerod Berger and Frank Kaminsky, big guy, stretch four, junior year improvement. So that's the optimist case that I would be banking on.
If you're going to lose a guy like Happ, it's nice to have a couple of upperclassmen guards who have gotten a lot of experience, taken a lot of big shots, played a lot of big minutes that you can lean on. And Wisconsin does have that in Demetric Trice and Brad Davison. Do you expect, I guess, the focus, especially offensively, to swing a little bit more toward those guys in the backcourt really handling a bigger load? Or do you think, as you kind of mentioned, does Reuvers now step in and really become a focal point? Maybe not quite as extreme as Happ was, but, kind of approaching that level.
I don't think Reuvers is going to approach the Happ level of dominance on offense. I think it'll definitely be more guard-heavy offense, as we've seen in the past with the Badgers. But Reuvers is going to take a step up, or at least he should, and I think it'll be kind of a three-headed monster with those guys. That would be the hope, that those guys are much more evenly distributed in the offense. And I think the big thing you're going to see is, obviously, the weird thing about the Badgers the last couple of years of having Happ and Iverson starting, neither of whom could take or make 3-pointers. And prior to, Happ being the main guy on the team, the Badgers have typically been a very 3-point heavy offense. And so I think that's what you're going to see. They're going to be more like, the Purdue type of offense, where they just fire up a lot of threes next year, including Reuvers. That's one of the strengths of his game, hopefully. So it'll be a much different offense. And, I don't want to get too optimistic, but I do feel that the last couple of years, the Badgers have been, Happ was easily their best player and kind of a special guy, but they arranged their offense around him, but it just wasn't, it wasn't a natural fit really for what I think Greg Gard really wants to do. So we'll see. We'll see if a more natural fit kind of lets people play to their strengths a little more.
Bart, I'm curious, Wisconsin fans in general obviously had a ton of admiration and respect for Bo Ryan and what he was able to do during his time there. The transition to Greg Gard, I feel like there's some people who are waiting for Wisconsin to kind of take a step backwards under him, and I feel like there's probably another set of Wisconsin fans that feel like he's going to be able to kind of continue what Bo Ryan did. Maybe not at the same level, but keep the program in the top tier of the Big Ten. Kind of where do you come down with your thoughts on Gard right now, and what's kind of the general temperature of the fan base in terms of how they feel about how he's performed so far?
Yeah, I think you laid it up pretty well, that there's a split, and there are a lot of fans who are disappointed that the recruiting hasn't gotten better, according to them. After the back-to-back Final Fours, that you want to jump in recruiting. In my mind, that was never something I thought was going to happen. Just not the way Wisconsin's program is set up. Obviously, they've had some unfortunate recruiting things happen, like Tyler Hero bailing out and going to Kentucky and having a great year and being a lottery pick. That's just kind of a tough pill for people to swallow, But my view on Gard is that I like Gard. He's not Bo Ryan, and we probably will never get Bo Ryan again. That kind of genius. Can't expect that, but I think he's trying to follow what has proven to work at Wisconsin, and I'm in support of that because, we tried a lot of different things that didn't work over several generations at Wisconsin. So I'm good with sticking with what's proven to work at Wisconsin. That said, I think this is a really big year because, like I said, as an optimist, I think there's a case to be made for this style program. This is a year where they should be pretty decent if the program is working and it's continuing to work. And if they aren't, if the sort of pessimistic case is right and end up being not even a bubble team, then you have to think, well, this really maybe isn't working unless something gets drastically better next year. So it's, in my opinion, it's a really pivotal year, and there are the early whiny fans obviously already out there, and it's not that Greg Gard certainly hasn't won anybody over and to think that he's going to be the coach forever no matter what happens, but what happens this year I think will sway a lot of people one way or the other.
The biggest question mark I see when I look at the roster is depth behind Reuvers. Is that kind of your same assessment? And what do they have behind him in the event that he gets in foul trouble or, has an off game?
Yeah, that's true. They got Micah Potter is the other big transfer from Ohio State. Theoretically, he's a mid-year transfer, but he sat out all of last year. So I think most people are assuming he'll get a waiver and be able to start at the start of the year. And even if he doesn't, it's a mid-December add-on. So that's presumably the starting front court is Potter and Happ. And then behind them, there's really not a lot. There's, the other big is Aleem Ford, who's not a banger at all. Sort of a finesse shooter kind of guy. They've got a redshirt freshman named Joe Hedstrom, who we don't really know much about. He was a preferred walk-on, so it wasn't like he was highly recruited or anything. So I agree I think if Reuvers gets into foul trouble, they're going to play small, frankly, because they do have several, guards and wings. So I could definitely see some 4-guard offense, or at least, wings and guards, if that scenario comes up.
Who do you look at as a kind of an X factor on this team? I think we kind of know what to expect from Trice and Davison. You expect them to continue to progress. We know about Reuvers' role. Who's kind of that next guy that if he really takes the next step in his development could make Wisconsin that top 25 type team, or if he, kind of lingers where he's at, is going to make it hard for them to reach that?
It's probably Kobe King. And he's had a lot of hype around him since he showed up on campus 2 years ago. I think like in, the preseason scrimmage, the red on white scrimmage or whatever, he was really impressive. And he's just kind of a different player somewhat than the Badgers get a lot of, in that he is more athletic. He's kind of an athletic wing. So people were excited about him. Then he was, he's playing as a true freshman those first 10 games. He hadn't set the world on fire or anything, but he was, as a Badger fan, it's unusual to see true freshmen play. And so if they do anything, you're pretty intrigued by that. And then he had some sort of crazy knee injury, missed the rest of that year. And then last year, I would have said the same thing probably before last year, and it didn't pan out, obviously, last year. So you wonder, like, the rumors are he just wasn't quite himself yet with his knee. So maybe that's right. And maybe this year is the Kobe King breakout year, where you've got a guy who's a more of an athletic guy who can finish in traffic and get to the rim, and supposedly, has a mid-range game too, and can shoot threes. So he's got some exciting possibilities if he can stay healthy and then take a leap, which he might. So that'd be the X factor. If Kobe King ends up being a guy this year who is, potentially starting or playing a lot of minutes, that would be really good for the Badgers, unless it's because everybody else got hurt.
Yeah. Now, my most important question for you. Is this season the first time since Michael Finley was there that Indiana wins at Wisconsin? Because we're all getting tired of that streak.
We know that they play at Wisconsin this year?
Yeah, they do, I believe.
Okay. I'll say no.
Safe bet.
But, I think we've seen the last few years, home court is somewhat of a lessening advantage. The conference schedule is just getting more and more. There's just more and more crazy things happen. So you never know. And obviously the Badgers in Indiana are going to be, even if my rankings are correct, which they're not, and the Badgers are 25th and Indiana's 55th or whatever, that's still going to be a very close to a toss-up game. That's just not that big a difference, really. So, but I'll hope that streak keeps going, because that's obviously a fun one for somebody who grew up watching Wisconsin lose Indiana 50 times in a row.
Yeah.
If Indiana can win at Michigan State last season in the middle of their complete collapse, I think it's fair to say anything could happen, but I'll go with Bart. I don't think this is the year that it happens either.
Yeah. Hey, when you see a 5 or 6% chance of victory, that was that happening. It's going to happen every now and then. So kind of transitioning into talking about Indiana and then also the Big Ten based on, your rankings. And again, go to barttorvik.com. You can check out those rankings. Does anybody else have preseason projections out? I know Ken Palm doesn't have his out yet.
Yeah, he hasn't published them as far as I know. Usually late October is when those get published. There are a few guys I follow on Twitter who I retweeted a guy named Brian the Fever, who has electronic or computerized rankings that are worth checking out. But other than that, not that I'm aware of.
So I'm curious because this is obviously a system that you built. I mean, you took work that Ken and other people had done and kind of put your own spin on it, and everybody does it a little bit differently. When you look at these rankings that come out, do you immediately say, "Whoa, I don't know that really makes sense"? Okay, Florida's number one. That is it. Are you so close to it that you're like, well, this is what the computer's telling me, so I kind of believe this? Or do you look at it like we do sometimes, where it's like, okay, we know there's a well-thought-out model here, but boy, Penn State being 20th, given their history, just doesn't really make sense. How do you look at your own rankings?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I don't. I would say the closer you are to them, the less likely you would be to view them as gospel, because it's like watching sausage get made or whatever. So I would say the way I view them is, I first of all would put a 20 spot error bar over everybody's rankings, and if I look at Penn State being 20th or so, I would say, well, that seems maybe a little high, but is 40th reasonable? And then I say, yeah, so maybe that's a best case scenario type ranking for Penn State. And I'm not going to I'll look into it and see what's going on. If I see a rating that's way higher than my subjective, viewpoint or other people's subjective viewpoints, sometimes I have an obvious error, like a missing player or a player that should have been gone, put into the pros or something like that. Other times it's more just I have a projection for a player that is kind of optimistic, and is there any way I can figure out a way to universally change that so that it applies to every team? And sometimes I'll think about that kind of stuff, and I do tweak it all the time. So it's not like these are set in stone, or that I think I've figured out the way to do preseason ratings by any stretch of the imagination. So the overall idea, or I guess the best reason to do these is it just kind of gives a different viewpoint that is supposed to be a little different than what the conventional wisdom would be, right? I could engineer them to be more similar to what other people are saying as that data comes in, but that kind of defeats the purpose of doing them, which is just kind of give an objective viewpoint based on reasonable inputs, and see where that differs from where other people are putting things, so that you look at those teams and say, well, no, that doesn't make sense. Or you're looking at sometimes and you say, oh, that's interesting. That's a team I never thought of in the top 25, and maybe that makes sense. So that's the way I look at it.
So I'm going to ask you, Bart, to be subjective here for a second. And the Big Ten teams that you have, is there one team that you look at and say, from somebody that just watches a lot of Big Ten basketball, that team maybe looks too high to me, and is there a team that you look at and say maybe that's too low? Because you said obviously there's going to be a range where teams could fall. I mean, obviously all these teams we're going to actually play games, and they're going to earn their ranking based on how they actually perform. But I'm just kind of curious from your perspective, if there's one team that you look at and say maybe they're, in my opinion, too high, and maybe one that I look at and say maybe they're a little too low.
Yeah, I guess so. Illinois, as I'm looking at this table here, is rated 14th, and a lot of people are optimistic about Illinois this year, and there's reasons to be optimistic, but that to me is hard to imagine still that high. I could see them being borderline top 25 team. Subjectively, I feel like that's more I feel like if you're an Illinois fan, that's more what you'd be hoping for this year, is that kind of progression rather than potential, slotting yourself into the second weekend of the NCAA tournament. So that one kind of jumps out at me as probably potentially above the 20 spot buffer, maybe the most likely to be above that buffer. As far as a team that's too low,
here's your chance.
So Indiana, I would say it could be that team. Although I would say that if you're talking about like the 20-point buffer, 20 spot buffer, I don't think that 37, for instance, I don't think that's the natural, subjectively where I think Indiana is. I think Indiana has a good case to be a bubble team, and frankly, I think like 57, which is where they're at now, there are plenty of bubble teams that come out that are 57th. Last year, I think Seton Hall was 60th in Ken Pom and was comfortably in the tournament. So if you truly are the 57th best team, you just need a couple things to go your way and you can be in the tournament. You just need to get a little, lucky, win a few close games, and you can easily get in the tournament at that level of team. And then if you're 10 spots better, 47, then you are a bubble team, even by your efficiency rating. So that's where I think especially, it gets a little skewed when you look at the order in the Big Ten Conference and you see Indiana's down there at 11th or whatever behind Rutgers. And that's like, oh, as you said, ugh, on the message boards. But if you start thinking like more of air bars, that's like, they're a middle of the pack team. They're projected to go 9 and 11 in the Big Ten. So I don't feel real bad about that one, even if I don't think that there's a huge chance that they'll be much worse than that. I think that that's kind of where I would slot them as a bubble team that, is looking to get in the tournament this year. The team that's kind of intriguing to me is Nebraska, which is down around 100, but they've just totally turned over their roster under Fred Hoiberg. And so that's one that, could be off by a lot, right? They could end up making the tournament. We just have no idea what that team's going to be like. And, my system's projection for them is, just as much a guess as anybody else's, really.
How much does the schedule that a team plays factor in? And I know that a lot of teams right now don't have their complete schedules in the system because you have it for some teams, but you don't have dates of Big Ten games. I don't think that would have any effect on when a team plays. But I'm kind of curious just how maybe these rankings will change between now and October, other than roster attrition. Does the schedule have anything to do with it?
The schedule shouldn't affect anything other than, every once in a while I'll actually run like the tournament simulations and tournament projections, like the bracketology type stuff. And schedule has an effect on that, obviously, because it takes into account quad one wins and things like that. So until the schedule gets more filled out, any kind of tournament projections will be goofy. But that's the only thing that would change with the addition of the actual schedules.
How do you account for, with Michigan, a coach like John Beilein leaving? Because we know how big of an impact he had just on a game-by-game basis and, leading that program, and now a total unknown in Juwan Howard. Yeah. Does that factor in to these preseason rankings?
It does a little bit, actually. And there is a coaching aspect to the ratings, and there is typically a penalty for losing your coach. And then there's also, I kind of have two different versions of a coaching change. One, which is like natural, and one that's sort of unnatural is kind of the way I do it in my system. And so basically there's kind of a date cutoff. And if, so John Beilein, to cut this short, is in the unnatural coaching change category, which penalizes them more. Just kind of brings them back closer to the mean. If John Beilein were still the coach, they would definitely be projected significantly higher. I think that, I think in the original ones I did, around the end of last season, when they still had all those guys coming back, I think Michigan was number 1 in the original run of these. And of course, they lost all those players, and then they lost their coach, and so they were down to in the 30s until they got Wagner, bumped them back up a little bit. But it definitely plays a factor. I will confess it's very speculative, and that's just kind of I try to account for it. Whether I do it well or not, I don't know.
who are some players in the Big Ten or even nationally, if you want to go there, that you're really intrigued by this season? Maybe you think are a little bit underrated by, by pundits or even fans, but kind of by looking at the numbers, looking at the efficiency, you're really high on.
Good question. Well, there's one guy that I really like because this just the guy who popped into my head is Obi Toppin for Dayton, who was a freshman last year. Let me see if I can find him because he almost led the country in dunks, which is one of the more unique things that I track on my site. And he was only a freshman. Yeah, he had 84 dunks last year for Dayton. And I think that the draft gurus are keeping track of this guy, even though he's at a mid-major. And then, a lot of times guys make a leap from their freshman to their sophomore year. So I'm pretty curious to see what he's going to do for Dayton. Is he going to lead the country in dunks? He's definitely a potential, competitor for that, along with Azubuike at Kansas, if he can stay healthy. He's kind of the most proficient dunker I think I've ever seen. So that's kind of a very under the radar that guy who just occurred to me. In the Big Ten, one of the teams that's intriguing is Iowa in general, especially with this uncertainty whether Bohannon's going to play. It's sounding more and more like he isn't going to play at all. But they've got some young guys on that team, and the one I'm thinking of is Joe Weiskamp, who a lot of people are really high on, and he's another guy who was making a potential leap as a sophomore, and could potentially be kind of an all-conference guy. So I'll be following him pretty closely.
You've got a lot of fun little nooks and crannies on your site. If you go to barttorvik.com, both clicking on stats, then the Funalytics, what's kind of your favorite stat that you have, or maybe a place that you don't think enough people know about on your site that you think people should go check out?
Yeah, I like to play around with a lot of stuff. Pretty much all this stuff is just stuff I wanted to see for myself, and so I put it out there. One relatively new one is the program charts. One under the stats tab, and it shows you can look at pretty much any stat for a team over time. Since 2008, the data that going back to the data that I have started in 2008. So you can look at trends and how a team's overall rating, their offense, their defense, or 3-point shooting, and things of that nature.
The 3-point shooting one for Indiana is really funny. It is all over the place.
And they've really struggled the last couple of years, right?
Oh yes.
So, and I don't know if they're going to hope they've got to go up this year, right? But,
well, they don't really have another direction to go in, unfortunately.
I guess so. Right. Regression to the mean can be your friend.
Yes.
So that's one that I enjoy, and you can compare two teams, or you can compare a team to the overall average, or to the conference average to kind of get an idea of where they stack up and what the trends are.
Bart, you mentioned Jordan Bohannon. That was kind of funny you mentioned him. I was going to actually ask you how a guy like that figures into the ratings right now. I noticed you have him on your projections. If he doesn't, once you get definitive word if he's going to play or not, do you take him out? Or like right now, you kind of have him in there as like 50% minutes. Another guy, like from Indiana perspective, is Jerome Hunter, who we don't know if he's going to play. I'm just kind of curious how those guys with the health issues kind of factor in at this point.
Yeah, if I hear definitively that Bohannon's redshirting, I'll take him out. Right now, I'm pretty sure I've got him in there as a half-season guy. I've got like a half-season designation, so that's why his minute. If that weren't the case, I'm sure he would be projected to be in 80+% minutes. And you can see that if you look at his projections, he's still projected to score 13 points a game, because I threw that up to a per game kind of thing. But if they do announce that he's redshirting, then I'll take him out, and that will affect Iowa severely. I think they'll fall into the 70s. I think I looked at that. And that's actually something you can do on my site. If you look under it's called the draft cast, because I put it in there to look at what would happen if guys declared early, but you can also just take a guy off a team using the draft cast and see what happens. It gives you at least an estimate of what would happen. and I think Iowa falls into the 70s. So Jerome Hunter, so he redshirted last year, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
He has kind of a mysterious medical condition that no one's really sure if he's going to be able to play or not.
Yeah, so a similar thing. If I hear definitively that he's not going to play, then I'll put him in the redshirt category again. Otherwise, I'll just kind of let the projections go where they go. And those are examples of, those are things I know about, or at least sort of know about, because I follow the Big Ten very closely. But if you're talking about 350 teams, there's probably one of those guys on almost every team. I don't know about them. So that's a huge source of variance. And I don't even necessarily call it inaccuracy in the ratings, just kind of because it might help, to be wrong about some of those things. But it's just, I think, an example of how hard it is to project college basketball. There's all that stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to ask you about a scenario now that Jerod might bring some pain to Jerod.
I'm not going to listen to this section.
But there's a team that you have about, let's see, 11 spots ahead of Indiana right now that seems to be coached by a former Indiana coach. Is there a scenario where Georgia makes the tournament this year and Indiana doesn't, in your mind?
I think there's a scenario. I mean, so they've got...
they got all these stud freshmen coming in.
Yeah, right. They got a big class, and Edwards is like, their top guy is he's a 5-star, top 10, maybe even top 5 guy, right? Something like that.
Yeah.
So those are guys, overall, the system is pretty conservative on freshmen. Even stuff. I mean, once you get out, like outside the top 5, it very quickly doesn't expect necessarily a whole lot out of them. But when you're talking about top 5 guys, there's a small but legitimate chance that it's Zion Williamson. It can happen. And Zion Williamson wasn't even the number 1 recruit last year. So it's definitely possible when you got a guy like that he can just carry a team at least to the tournament. And I think that's where that kind of that 50-ish rating for Georgia comes from, is that, they could be pretty decent with that kind of talent on the roster. And, and I think, as we've talked about before, my view on Tom Crean has always been, when he gets talent, he's done pretty well. His big issue has been when he doesn't have top talent, he doesn't get the most out of it. So it's definitely an intriguing team.
Yeah. So one final question for you. And, by the way, one of the other sections of your site that I really like, that I've used a lot and that I always end up citing a lot on this podcast, on the Assembly Call, is where you can look by date, by segments, and look at the ratings. So I remember in Archie Miller's first year, toward the end of the year, Indiana had a top 10 defense over the last 6 weeks. And then, I would torture myself last year in the midst of the, losing 12 out of 13 games to see where they were just with that segment. Indiana was ranked, in the 200s, which absolutely matched what the eye test was telling us. But that's another really interesting feature of your site. I'm curious, we know that when Ken started publishing his data, that it changed how teams looked at things. And, Archie Miller has mentioned, being on there, checking the adjusted defensive ratings, all of that. Do you know of, or do you have any stories of coaches or teams using your site and any of the stats on your site as they, prepare for games and analyze what they're doing? I've
been in contact with some assistant coaches and graduate assistants who are curious about this stuff. And everybody's looking for an edge in college basketball, so people will reach out. I think Ken Pom is still there's still so much available there, and is deservedly kind of the industry standard. So I think it can be a tough sell from the assistants on up, who are more naturally in this, to say, hey, you got to look at this Bart Torvik site, when they've just only recently been able to convince them to look at Ken Pom. So it's certainly not something that I try to encourage or anything like that, but it is interesting to talk to these guys. And the takeaway from those conversations is just that everybody is desperate for an edge, so they're definitely looking at these sites, including sites like mine, to make what they can of it.
We can make this the last question. Really appreciate your time.
Sure.
do you have a sense for, and maybe just college basketball in general, like what coaches have become really good, or college basketball in general has become much better at incorporating from an advanced analytics standpoint, and maybe where it's still lacking? Like where you see, look, the numbers are saying do this more, don't do this. Why are so many coaches still doing this? Like what inefficiencies do you still see out there?
Well, I definitely, this is not a news flash, but the 3-point rate is an example, I think, of where analytics has really changed people's minds and what they do. The 3-point rate has gone up consistently every year for the past 6 or 7 years, I think, or at least 5 years.
And to be clear, that's volume of attempts, not percentage.
Right. Exactly. The percentage, I believe, was going up until last year. I could be wrong about that. I'd have to look. But, so it's basically, that was kind of the Villanova way of doing it. And obviously, Golden State, it's been in the NBA too, and the Rockets. It's just kind of, it finally sunk in that 3 is more than 2, right? So it's that's I think, a very well-known analytic story where coaches have just, the math is pretty easy and very compelling. So, and it's gotten to the point now where they're changing the rules because of it, right? They're moving the 3-point line back because people just kind of aren't comfortable with so many threes, as far as I understand. That's why they're moving it back. So as far as an inefficiency that's still there, that's a tough question, because that's something that everybody wants to find, right? I like to point out Bo Ryan, I think, found some inefficiencies back in the day, with basically turnovers and limiting turnovers and defensive rebounding were 2 things that the Badgers were always just great at. And I think those are things that are sort of under your control. A lot of what happens on a basketball court is, there's a lot of chance involved, but limiting turnovers and protecting the defensive glass are things that you can really improve on through coaching and effort. And so that was kind of this area where the Badgers got free points, basically, for a lot of years. And then now, if you look at the Badgers' rankings in those categories, their rankings have gotten significantly worse under Greg Gard, but the actual percentages, the actual number of rebounds, percentage of rebounds that they're allowing, and turnover percentage that they commit is really not that different. And so what that tells me is that other coaches have figured out that those are things that they can get better at without really a trade-off. So that was an inefficiency that was out there that's pretty much gone. I'm not a basketball genius, so I can't tell you what efficiency is still there. I'm sure there are some, and that will be, so you could look at what coaches are outperforming their talent and try to figure out what they're doing. Like, what is Chris Beard doing? How is he doing this? And I'm sure coaches are looking at Texas Tech and trying to figure out how he is doing this. And one way he's doing it is he's getting number 350 recruits that become one and dones, right?
Yeah.
But there's probably something else to it also. And that's how I would try to figure it out if I were going to try to figure it out, is look at the coaches who are outperforming their talent.
I know Jerod said that was the last question, but I do have one more thing I want to ask you before I let you go. The net ratings last year were a big topic of discussion. There was those, I think, who were involved directly with the NCAA trying to tout it as an improvement. There were other people who were critics of it. Kind of, where did you come down now that we're kind of a year removed from it? Was it a positive for the game? And would you like to see more transparency as we move along as to how it's calculated so that we can better understand what it's actually doing?
I'd love to see more transparency. Overall, by the end of the season, I would say I'm a net fan. I think it's been a while since I thought about the net, actually, but I think it basically revealed itself, at least in the output, to be kind of an efficiency rating, like KenPom or like my ratings. It very closely tracked them with just like some outliers, which you could understand. And so for what they use it for, I think that's pretty appropriate for using it for how to judge a win and a loss. Which is how they've always used, or at least in the last 15 years, how they've used the RPI. And that's an appropriate way to use a power rating, I think. Obviously you don't want to just take the top 45 KenPom teams because you can get, teams that don't win enough games, and you want the winning to matter. But if you're saying, if the way you're judging tourney resumes is by looking at who has the most best wins, then you do want to know who's got the wins over the actual best teams that are the hardest to beat. And I think that the net was a massive improvement over RPI in that sense. It's not the ideal. The ideal is some sort of strength of record or wins above bubble, which I track on my site. Because what that does is it assigns basically every win and loss has an amount associated with it that you just count up, or a percentage chance. And so every game counts as it should count, rather than these buckets that the committee uses where, you get into these threshold issues, and we have no idea how much more they count a quadrant 1 over a quadrant 2. It seems like it's pretty significant, and does it really matter? Is it that much better to beat 49 than 51 on a neutral court? Obviously not. And to some extent, there are humans involved, so they can make those decisions, but they can't. There's just no way humans can really process all that information, and it's actually pretty easy to get that's all translated into one number, wins above bubble or strength of record, that tells you a lot about how good a team's season was.
The arbitrary endpoints of the quadrants are probably the most annoying part about being a college basketball fan. I remember, watching last year, Is Butler, yes, they're 48th. This is a quad 1 win. It's like, yeah. I agree. There's got to be a better way to do that.
Yep, and there is.
I think you just said it.
Yep.
Well, Bart, thank you. BartTorvik.com is the site. Twitter is totally T-bomb. Where are the underscores? Totally _T_bomb. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right.
Yep, he's a great follow on Twitter. Follow him there, and we really appreciate it. And we look forward to some good-natured trash talking when Indiana and Wisconsin face off this year. It should be.
Thanks for having me on.
Yep. Thanks, Bart.
All right, you're welcome.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com, and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.
I always refresh Ken Palm start refreshing about October 15th, waiting for the ratings drop. And
yeah, it'll be interesting. I don't know if you guys saw this, that he shared some rankings with a Syracuse beat writer.
Saw that, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And he had Penn State. He had Penn State pretty high, didn't he?
Yeah, 24th. So that made me feel good.
Man, everybody's loving Penn State.
Penn State's this is year 9 of Pat Chambers, and he's made the NIT once and the CBI once. I don't know.
Yeah, we never got around to talking to it, but that's the thing about them is if you look at their efficiency rating the last couple of years, they've been good, right? Especially 2 years ago, they were top 20-ish.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what my system sees as kind of a baseline. And you could say, well, a lot of that, maybe it's phony, maybe it's not. But the system sees kind of an unlucky team, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they always play teams tough. It just seems like they're, by the end of the season, they're one of those teams that is dangerous in the Big Ten tournament, but then they win a game or two, and then they just kind of go.
There's definitely just an X factor missing, right? And it doesn't seem like Chambers.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, he seems like a good dude. It's just I don't know if anybody could really win there, but it's kind of a weird spot to be in when you have no enthusiasm at all for the program.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if they could even make a better hire, so it's just kind of a bad spot to be in.
Well, yeah, when your coach leaves for Navy voluntarily, it's a bad sign.
It's probably not good.
Exactly.
Probably not good.
After going to the NCAA tournament.
Yeah.
That's true.
Oh, man.